Yes. So my Substack, it's basically a glorified blog. It's called Tradition and Sanity. So far, no one has started an alternative Substack called Renewal and Insanity. That hasn't happened yet, but when it does, I'll let you know about that. So, all right, so my talk tonight is why should Pope Francis and the FBI care about the Latin Mass? It's a good question. In a memo subsequently officially disowned, the Federal Bureau of Investigation identified traditional Latin Mass-going Catholics as potential domestic terrorists. Curiously, Pope Francis seems to agree to some extent with the FBI, for he has targeted Latin Mass Catholics, a minority of the faithful who prefer to worship in a sacred form handed down for centuries, as ecclesiastical terrorists, so to speak. They are upsetting the peace and order of the post-Vatican II Church. As a lifelong Catholic, I can't say that I've really seen a whole lot of peace and order to be disturbed, but that could be just my limited experience. Why should the FBI care? What, especially, is the Pope's beef with the Latin Mass? Why can't he leave law-abiding, God-fearing, tradition-loving Catholics alone? But you see, the whole problem is that they are law-abiding, God-fearing, and tradition-loving. Francis is an antinomian, that is, someone who thinks law is generally bad, unless, paradoxically, he can fashion laws that favor his antinomian agenda. He confuses the gospel with liberation from laws, precepts, rules, regulations, all of which are deemed rigid, which is a very bad quality in his worldview. Francis does not seem to fear God in his many attacks on Catholic doctrine, morals, and the people of God, sowing confusion and scandal all over the world. And he certainly does not love tradition. He routinely mocks those who value it, calling them backwardists, that is, people who supposedly want to go back in time, back before the council, right? As if there's only one. Of course, the accusation is groundless and downright silly. Most of those who attend the Old Mass are much too young to remember anything about Vatican II, let alone the era before it. And they simply love what is beautiful, majestic, otherworldly, and palpably religious. Not for them a humanitarian, utopian, liberation theology, Catholicism blended with the agenda of the United Nations. Contrary to the standard narrative in the mainstream media, the Vatican's moves against Latin Mass Catholics are not caused by the bad behavior of traditionalists. I really want to emphasize this point. The members of the Society of St. Pius X have been saying and doing all the same things for decades, and Rome always more or less let them alone or tried to work with them. Each pope in turn has met with the SSPX's current head for private conversation. Decades ago, well-known traditionalist writers like Michael Davies were addressing the same topics and in much the same way as can be seen today on the internet. Joseph Ratzinger was friendly with Michael Davies and other members of the International Una Voce Federation, welcoming them warmly in Rome and treating them kindly in all that concerned their objectives. Of all men in the Vatican, Cardinal Ratzinger would have been most aware of the growing worldwide desire for the TLM. I'm going to use that abbreviation tonight, TLM, for traditional Latin Mass. This is why, as Pope Benedict XVI, he greatly broadened its use in 2007 with his apostolic letter Summorum Pontificum. Benedict didn't think it would remain an obscure interest of a statistically marginal population. On the contrary, he already recognized in his own words that, quote, in the meantime, since Vatican II, it has been clearly demonstrated that young persons too have discovered this liturgical form, felt its attraction, and found in it a form of encounter with the mystery of the Most Holy Eucharist particularly suited to them, unquote. That's from his letter to bishops on July 7th, 2007. He knew the TLM was poised for rapid growth, and in retrospect, he was right. At a time when Catholicism in the Western world is declining by every metric, traditional communities were growing by leaps and bounds. All this has been well documented. So what has changed is not the attitude or the views of traditionalists, but rather the hostility towards traditional expressions of Catholicism in the man who currently occupies the chair of St. Peter. That's what's changed. The reason for Francis's opposition is nothing other than the continued growth of religious communities like the Franciscan Friars of the Immaculate, diocesan clergy being drawn increasingly to the TLM, the ex-ecclesia Dei communities growing, I mean the Fraternity of St. Peter, the Institute of Christ the King, the Institute of the Good Shepherd, places like that, overflowing congregations wherever these things exist. He opposes these trends for the same reasons he opposes anything and everything traditional or even conservative. Remember, he made fun of the spiritual bouquet offered to him early in his papacy because he said that nobody should be counting their prayers. He unflatteringly connected large families with the breeding habits of rabbits. He refused to meet the dubia cardinals, although Father James Martin's dubia about the LGBTQ+ community were answered in 24 hours. He never misses an occasion to hammer on the supposed psychological disorder of rigidity. He wrung his hands about sexual abuse while promoting and protecting abusers. He shed crocodile tears about liturgical abuse as he engaged in it himself, and on and on. A basic knowledge of human psychological types and of Bergoglio's ecclesiastical career would indicate that he was going to tighten the noose at some point. He is a Peronist dictator who lives by the motto, "For the friend, everything, for the enemy, not even justice." Even if every traditional Catholic behaved like a 1950s Girl Scout, he would still have it out for them. Indeed, especially if they behaved like 1950s Girl Scouts. For his war is against the pre-conciliar church, quote unquote, and in favor of the ultimate and lasting hegemony of the spirit of the council. That is, the revolutionary interpretation of Vatican II that elevates it into a super dogma separate from and substituted for the theology and practice of all preceding centuries and generations. The traditional movement, as small as it is a reminder that the revolution has not been completely successful. The reprogramming has not reached everyone. Indeed, to the perplexity and irritation of the revolutionary forces, the divine blessings of fruitfulness, spiritual, sacramental, and domestic, have unmistakably followed this restorationist constituency. One often finds people expressing shock that the Pope is picking on a tiny minority. Here's an eloquent example of that puzzlement, which I saw on Facebook. Quote, "Have you noticed how often in the last couple of years the Pope's off-the-cuff comments have focused on traditionalists? There are 50 grave problems in the church that need major papal attention, and this is what smolders on his mind constantly? Pope Francis's priorities are clear in this. To heck with all those other problems. It's the 1% tradies who need to be dealt with, not the 99% of dreadful masses, the 99% of heretical, quote-unquote, Catholic colleges, the 99% of degenerate bishops, etc. Even if tradies were wrong in loving tradition, his inattention to the vastly larger problems is mind-boggling," unquote. So that was just somebody wrote that on Facebook. I disagree. This obsessive and seemingly disproportionate campaign against the traditionalists is, in fact, perfectly logical. Pope Francis realizes that the only effective resistance to the modernist remake of Catholic doctrine, morals, and liturgy is coming from this zealous minority, who have shown every sign of burgeoning numbers and influence. Remember, and I cannot underline this point often enough, it is always creative minorities who change the course of history, not the majority who float along with the spirit of the age. This is a law that you can see throughout the whole of human history. Every reform movement, indeed every revolution, for good or for ill, has begun with an individual or a handful of people. What is at stake is not merely liturgical preference, but the dogmatic structure of Catholicism, the historical theological continuity of the Church, and the soundness of Christian morality. Pope Francis's tactical hits in all of these areas show that the ultimate aim is the transformation of the Catholic faith into something quite other than it has been. That is why our opposition to his entire agenda, which I would say has Traditionis Custodes as its poster child, must be inflexible, determined, and indefatigable, and why obedience must be tendered only to what is true and good, not to what is false and wicked. Often one hears conservative Catholics saying, "Why do you spend so much time, you traditionalists, diagnosing problems, errors, failings, and abuses? Should we not focus our attention on what is good?" Of course, we should be focusing our attention on what is good. That indeed is why traditional Catholics pray with the ancient rites, follow the age-old devotions, adhere to the crystal clear teaching of the magisterium. These are good things. We love them because they're good things. But just as one must first clear a road of debris before it can be traveled on, so too one must clear away errors to make room for truth. One must attack vice as well as promote virtue. It is precisely adherence to what is positive that demands the unambiguous identification and rejection of what is negative. Indeed, living according to the truth in and of itself exposes the works of darkness for what they are: lies, deviations, seductions, and perversions. There is importance in diagnosing what went wrong and how we might repair some of the damage. For certainly, the Church is in shambles throughout the Western world, and no amount of forced optimism can hide from us the urgency of addressing the root problems. These are, of course, spiritual in nature, but the liturgy is above all a spiritual reality, and one cannot escape the necessity of facing and answering the increasingly insistent questions raised over the course of the past 50 years as we see the Church crumble more and more. One thing I appreciate about the online world, which has so many downsides, as we all know, I'm not on Twitter, by the way, for that very reason, is that it enables me to take the pulse, so to speak, of fervent young Catholics who describe what made them Catholic or keeps them Catholic, at a time when it is definitely not cool to be Catholic, as far as the secular world's hocus-pocus religion is concerned. Such Catholics almost always circle around sooner or later, usually sooner, to the attractive power of tradition. Here's what one commenter said, speaking on behalf of his circle of friends. Quote, "Tradition is the only way forward, and we must move into the future with Catholic tradition, not backwards to 1970. All forward-looking Catholics, especially the young ones, see the necessity of embracing the continuity of tradition. Francis wants to lead us into the past of 1970, into a fabricated liturgy which has no roots because a plastic tree cannot take root. The Church's DNA is tradition, so healthy cells will not stop growing to replace the ones he destroys as long as there is life and breath in her." Unquote. In an article in the San Diego Union Tribune, published on April 7th, so not very long ago, Luke Heinschel, a father of 3 small children, writes, quote, "That ancient liturgy has a sort of beauty to it that is otherworldly. Life is saturated with all that is new, relevant, and flashy, but this form of worship seems set apart from the rest of life. My family has come to appreciate this silent order as a retreat from a chaotic world of sensory overload. Catholics who are attracted to this form of worship are not worshiping ashes. We hope to preserve the fire of our living tradition. Many parents have a desire to hand on a Christian way of life that seems to be disappearing from today's society. That is what tradition is, handing on. The rituals and forms of worship of our forebears are important in that handing on." Unquote. By the way, it's just interesting to note how often since Traditionis Custodes, mainstream secular newspapers have been carrying articles like this. Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, all over the place, right? A priest described a solemn traditional Latin Mass held for the Feast of the Assumption in the Cathedral Basilica of Philadelphia in the following words, quote, There are still many daunting challenges for those who love the traditional rites of the Church, but we have come such a long way, and we must never stop moving forward. Love for the traditional Mass and rites is a youth movement. Those involved are on fire with the Catholic faith. 1,000 people spent 2 hours and 15 minutes in church on a beautiful Friday evening in August. They could have gone to a seashore resort, to a baseball game, to a nightclub, or to any diversion. Instead, they immersed themselves in prayer, relished the sacred liturgy, honored Our Lady, and praised God. And they went out into the world filled with grace and joy. What a blessed event." Unquote. A young lady of my acquaintance wrote to me these stirring words. Quote, Coming to appreciate this continuity with our Catholic past was hugely important in my liturgical conversion. She puts that conversion in quotation marks. When I was on the Novus Ordo side of things, I felt a lot of angst and embarrassment about the difference between the modern liturgies in which I assisted and the Latin Masses I saw in old movies or heard described by elderly people. I knew that the traditional liturgy was that of virtually all of the saints, and I had an uneasy sense that the saints, my towering models and my interceding friends, would not be pleased with what we had done to the Mass. But when I came home to the traditional Mass, I felt no angst or embarrassment. Grafting myself on to the worship of the earliest centuries was quite literally like being a little tiny branch that suddenly experiences the benefits of being attached to a wide and towering tree. Unquote. A German monk who converted to the faith at the age of 18 and who discovered the TLM at the age of 21 left this account of his experience. Quote, "At the age of 18, I converted from Protestantism to the Catholic Church. The reason, to come home. But I was not really satisfied because the liturgy was just too flat for me. With the Lutherans, everything was rather conservative. At that time, I had never heard of Vatican II. Then there was a good hint. Through a magazine, I read something about the Abbé du Barou in Provence, which follows the old Latin rite. Right in the same year, it was September, I took the big trip to the south, a real adventure. After many hours by train, then by bus, I finally arrived in Le Barou. With my small backpack, I walked up the small road, up a hill, till someone picked me up and gave me a ride the rest of the way. I spent 2 weeks in this monastery. It was all new to me, but at the same time, so familiar. After the solemn ceremony, I went out of the church with a feeling of being filled to the brim. I could not stop my tears. Finally, I knew that God had touched the earth and that I was infinitely loved by him." Unquote. Another gentleman explained in an interview on EWTN that the final push in his decision to convert to Catholicism was attending a solemn Latin Mass. He describes his reaction as follows, quote, "And I wept like a baby. That was the moment in my life when I said, this has to be it. I don't know why this has to be it, but this has to be it. Because Christ revealed himself to me in this liturgy. I knew intellectually that the church was it, but I didn't trust her yet because I didn't actually see her living. And for me, it was the traditional Latin Mass which really made me first say, I need to become a Roman Catholic." Unquote. These are powerful testimonials. They really are. At one point in my life, I tried to collect as many such testimonials as I could because I figured it would be helpful for my writing on the subject. And I mean, obviously, it has been helpful. I'm sharing some of it with you right now. But honestly, I've had to give up collecting them because of the sheer volume of such statements is overwhelming at this point. For example, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops asked young Catholics a few years ago to tell them what keeps them in the church. The US CCB's Facebook and Twitter pages ended up plastered with young men and women singing the praises of the TLM and its captivating effects on them, as well as their hunger for orthodox doctrine and clear moral teaching. The bishops weren't expecting this at all, and to their credit, allowed the comments to stand. I mean, they could have just gone delete, 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 but they didn't do that. Let me just share one of these comments that was posted on the US CCB site. Quote, "I converted to the Catholic faith at 25 years old because Catholicism is true. I found the Latin Mass and immersed myself in the works of the saints and traditional catechisms. Young people don't need a watered-down, easy faith. We need the support of our bishops." Unquote. It's hard to improve on that. So to return to my earlier theme, why is it that some Catholics in the Church today, especially members of the hierarchy, and especially the Pope, find it so hard to understand the passionate love of the Latin Mass and see it as threatening? Let's start with the first objection they make, which they consider to be lethal. The proponents of Vatican II and the Novus Ordo tell us that the Latin Mass prevents what they call active participation. In the words of the Council, participatio actuosa. This form of liturgy turns the congregation into silent spectators who just sit there and do nothing but watch the priest who does everything on their behalf. Isn't this humiliating and infantile? Shouldn't we be showing by our words and actions that we are offering the Mass too, along with the priest, instead of being so passive? The problem here is a terribly inadequate, oversimplified, superficial notion of what it means for believers to participate or take part in the act of divine worship. As Dom Alcuin Reid explains, actual participation is primarily our internal connection with the liturgical action, with what Jesus Christ is doing in his church in the liturgical rites. This participation is about where my mind and heart are. Our external actions in the liturgy should serve and facilitate this. Archbishop Cordileone suggests that a more helpful translation of the word actuosa would be engaged, in the sense that we are present to the liturgical action, allowing it to seep down into the depths of our consciousness. In contemporary English, active means the contrary of passive or receptive. Yet from a Christian perspective, these are by no means contrary. In imitation of the Blessed Virgin Mary, I can be actively receptive to the Word of God. I can be actualizing my ability to be acted upon by the chants, prayers, and ceremonies of the Mass. As Pope John Paul II explained with incomparable clarity, quote, "Active participation certainly means that in gesture, word, song, and service, all the members of the community take part in an act of worship, which is anything but inert or passive. Yet, active participation does not preclude the active passivity of silence, stillness, and listening. Indeed, it demands it. Worshippers are not passive, for instance, when listening to the readings or the homily or following the prayers of the celebrant and the chants and music of the liturgy. These are experiences of silence and stillness, but they are in their own way profoundly active. In a culture which neither favors nor fosters meditative quiet, the art of interior listening is learned only with difficulty. Here we see how the liturgy, though it must always be properly inculturated, must also be countercultural." Unquote. As a matter of fact, when it comes to powerful non-verbal symbolic communication, the Latin Mass has decided advantages. It speaks powerfully to levels of the mind and heart that are not so easily reached, if they are ever reached at all, by a large quantity of spoken vernacular, simplified ceremonies, and a horizontal mode of celebration where the priest is facing and interacting with the people. The traditional Latin Mass, being thoroughly pre-modern, works counterculturally against those assumptions of the modern West that have proved corrosive to the Catholic faith. Let me mention some of those assumptions. The rationalism that limits understanding to clear and distinct ideas capable of verbal delivery and thereby eviscerates mystery, humility, and desire. The utilitarianism that asks what use we can make of something rather than how we might surrender to a reality that entirely escapes our control. The voluntarism that turns free choice into an unmoored self-creator, neglecting our radical dependence on God's will and the gift of his grace. The minimalism that looks for the quickest, easiest way to fulfill an obligation and loses sight of the costly veneration we owe to the holy. And the materialism that sees no more in man than his fleshly senses and instincts, ruling out mortification and the longing for spiritual goods. These attitudes, these isms, and others like them, crept pervasively into the reformatory plans of 20th century Christians, blinded by optimism and busied with the project of updating religion to modern times and tastes. The classical Roman rite, on the other hand, is utterly and blessedly anachronistic in that it shares none of these preoccupations. It rides on the strength of 16 centuries and more of supernatural faith that drove the missions to convert the peoples of the world. It contains the power to supernaturalize our excessively naturalistic minds. It can convert us post-Christian neo-pagans to the timeless liberating truth of the gospel. In order to have these effects, the liturgy must reach deep within us, not remaining on the surface level of our words and bodily actions. That is what is usually called active participation. Dom Alcuin Reid again beautifully explains why. Quote, "In our word-saturated society, we have perhaps forgotten that the liturgy is primarily an action, not a discourse. The liturgy is not a set of words read at us, or by us, or with us. It is a rite, a complex of actions, gestures, and sounds in given places. Yes, it includes words, but the liturgy's use of them goes beyond the efficient communication of information and ideas to which we are accustomed as moderns. For it is not simply what is said in a liturgical rite that is important. Rather, it is what is done that is crucial." Or you could also say, that's the end of Dom Alcuin's quote, you could also say it's not just what is said, but how it is said. It will help if we shift our metaphor from our doing of something, which is what the word active usually suggests, to our being drawn into something. When we watch a masterful stage play, or listen to an interesting conversation, or attend a concert of great music, we may not ever do anything towards it in the external forum. We are not among the actors or musicians on stage, or one of the conversationalists, but we are certainly drawn into it. In such a situation, our properly human activity is quite vigorous. We can become so absorbed in it that we forget where we are or how much time has passed. Our life may be profoundly changed by such an experience. No one says that those who attend a great classical concert of a Beethoven symphony, that, they're just passive. They should be more active. I mean, if you're listening well is an activity. It's actually a rather challenging activity. You have to train yourself to, train your ears to listen for that, right? Habituate yourself to that receptivity. The judgment that the laity at the traditional Latin Mass are reduced to mute, inert spectators is not only unjust, it is also foolish, because it fails to appreciate the transformative power of attentive sight and intellectual vision, or in plain English, just watching something beautiful and being caught up in it and changed by it. The same can be said for listening to the speech or music of another, absorbing what one hears and letting it carry one away. The ancient Roman Mass draws us up into itself in this manner. It makes us active by acting on us in certain ways and eliciting a certain response. In an article intriguingly called "The Mass Does Not Teach, Yet We Learn," Patrick Kornmeier, having described how much one learns by watching and listening to wiser people having a conversation, then draws a parallel with the traditional Mass. Quote, "I am a spectator as a child is a spectator. I watch to learn. I am awestruck at the privilege of watching the professionals talk to God and offer him fitting worship. I watch them take care to move gracefully and naturally, for I too must glorify God in my body. I watch them speak to God and to us in the sight of God with an acute propriety resulting from 2,000 years of distillation, when they show me how to both intimately whisper to God and announce his wonders in the church's very words and melodies. I learn that there really are some things more important than myself, more important than my ability to understand them, and in certain circumstances more important than my right to even hear them. I learn, and thereby I enter, or rather I am assumed into the priest's sacerdotal office, so that the priest's prayer becomes one with my own prayer, if I so choose. The Mass will go on with or without me. All truth is dense, and this density renders it infinitely fascinating if I still have a sense of wonder. I may attend a sung Mass and focus on the chanted propers. I might follow along word for word with the priest's text. I might cultivate interior acts of virtue or meditate on a single word or phrase. I may exult in the symmetrical perfection of priest, deacon, and subdeacon, moving in perfect harmony from the introit at the epistle side of the altar to the Gloria at the middle, seeing in it a glimpse of single yet triune action. I might shudder at the sublimity of the priest, qua Christ, ritually exalted and commissioned with uttering the very words of Christ over the bread and wine. I might be moved to penance when I see the total effacement of the priest, insofar as he is a man and is expected to deny himself completely. I can learn to do this too, because I've been taught to do so by watching the experts do it. The crowning beauty is that the expert is not this particular priest, but the Catholic priesthood and liturgy itself, chiseled through nearly 2 millennia and surviving the Roman Empire and its fall, the barbarian invasions, the Islamic conquests, the Viking incursions, the Eastern Schism, the Avignon papacy, the Reformation, the French Revolution, and 2 world wars. Unquote. That's Patrick Kornmeier. In the school of the Old Mass, everyone remains a pupil for his entire life on the sure-footed path to wisdom. Everyone is humbled by the transcendental vision that escapes our grasp. No one is put on the spot as an object. No one is coerced. The focus always lies elsewhere. There is disciplined freedom. All are subject to the same rule, so that in union with Christ, who is subjected to the Father, God may be all in all. We are submerged in an entire curriculum that is pre-rational and supra-rational. We are reconfigured by concerns that are deep and distant, but for that reason pierce the heart more sharply than anything relevant or useful. It requires more and more if we take it seriously, and opens horizons we never knew existed. So this objection about active participation turns out to be not only weak, but ironic, since the TLM seems to foster in many attendees a higher, more personal, more effective, more transformative kind of participation. When people attend the TLM, they are thrown into a form of worship that is unabashedly sacred, God-centered, and heaven-directed, fiercely dogmatic and politically incorrect, appealing to something profound within man's soul. It calls out to those who are serious searchers. It rewards those who stumble upon it by divine favor. It grows in attractive power as the rest of the church wanders into irrelevancy. It may still be a lamp barely taken out from under its bushel. It may still be a tiny light shining in a vast darkness and blocked from view by mountainous ecclesiastical barriers. But it is really there, and the warmth and luminosity of it is unmistakable once you get within range of it. People are drawn upwards by the worship of the transcendent God and forwards by the pride of receiving and delivering a great inheritance. These things give us a sense of belonging at a time when so many are rejecting their families, their cultures, their identities, their very selves. This great inheritance gives us a sense of stability in an age that is formless and void. The solution to the mess we have fallen into by a long series of bad decisions is simple and at the same time exceedingly hard. We have to make the opposite decisions again and again. The church needs to stop thinking about new strategies, new programs, new pastoral initiatives, new synods, God help us, or any statistical measures of success, and resolutely throw herself again into the proclamation of the full gospel, including its hard sayings. The celebration of solemn and beautiful liturgies, the building of monasteries and religious communities on the foundation of the TLM, the cultivation of an intellectually robust curriculum in seminaries and universities, an encouragement of large families as in the old days, and the promotion of homeschooling. Only by taking a serious countercultural stand Is there any long-term hope for Catholicism? I'm speaking now on a natural level. As a believer, I am convinced that the faith will survive and will prosper again, but only where such things are being done and only to the degree that they are being done. Now, active participation may be the most common issue that arises. It's the spontaneous and lazy talking point for justifying a world of abuses, iconoclasms, and cancellations. But there is a deeper explanation, I think, for the phenomenon of a deep-seated fear or hatred of the TLM on the part of clergy. On the theological plane, modernism teaches that each age or generation ought to find or perhaps evolve its own set of practices and concepts that work for it. Those who are in the grip of this evolutionary fallacy, their number regrettably includes many professional theologians, senior clerics, bishops, and cardinals, and certainly Pope Francis, are bound to view the unexpected return of what they consider a burnt-out liturgy of yesteryear as a threat to the necessary aggiornamento or contemporary updating of the Church. Even so-called conservatives seem to have convinced themselves that the Church had to come of age, update itself in order to survive and thrive. The reality has been the opposite. The Church's influence and numbers plummeted when she started courting modernity in this manner. Driven by a kind of passive-aggressive institutional logic, as Pope Pius X demonstrates in his encyclical Pascendi Dominici Gregis, modernism is incapable of recognizing the suicidal tendencies of its own premises. The process of updating, as they understand it, can never be successful because time is always moving on. Like a carton of milk, modernization always has an expiration date. Condemned to timeliness, the Church will either end up changing everything and thereby cease to be recognizable as the same Catholic Church, or be quickly out of date for having changed too little. In the minds of modernists, the solution for the Church's continuing decline is to accelerate modernization, since they believe, if we're assuming that they're not trying to destroy the Church. They might be if they were Freemasons. I'm not entertaining that hypothesis at the moment. But on the assumption that they don't actually want to destroy the Church, they believe that the problem is that the Church has not adapted herself enough to the momentous changes of modernity. She will not be right, in their view, until she has shed the last traces of anything ancient, medieval, or pre-modern, and has fully caught up to science, democracy, the sexual revolution, the free individual conscience, environmentalism, interreligious fraternity, or whatever the cause du jour happens to be. This, by the way, is not a caricature. This is the view of such influential churchmen as the late Cardinal Martini, Cardinal Casper, Cardinal Grech, Cardinal Hollerich, and there are others too, in very influential places. Tradition-loving Catholics hold exactly the opposite. We adhere to the faith because it is true across all ages until the end of time, and we reject modern errors because they conflict with the truth about God, Christ, man, and the world. We know that the Church makes a serious impact on society and culture only to the extent that she lives at a level beyond the merely temporal and temporary. The way we practice our religion enshrines our anti-modernism because traditional worship is heavily marked by elements from every age through which the Church has passed, amalgamated and elevated into signs of perpetual youthfulness and immortality. You can imagine how thoroughly all this must dismay and enrage the modernists in our midst. On the practical plane, clergy from the mid-1950s to the mid-1970s were psychologically abused by constant and often radical and arbitrary changes to Catholic life and to the liturgy in particular, which were forced upon them and upon the long-suffering laity as the will of the Holy Father or the teaching of the Council or the judgment of the Church, even when in many cases they were nothing of the sort. So deep was the hyper-papalism, so luxuriant the invention of conciliar mandates, so heavy-handed the lowering of the boom, that many clergy, if not all, must have had to do violence to their thoughts and feelings in order to swallow these changes. In other words, they had to convince themselves, in spite of so many instincts, appearances, and warnings to the contrary, that it was all for the best, and that the old ways were not only out of date, but now spiritually harmful in the new spirit-led phase of the church. This is why the sharpest opposition to the return of traditional worship is from today's older generations who lived through the conciliar period and/or its immediate aftermath. And unfortunately, those are almost everybody in the ruling category, right? Sure, there were Catholics who greeted the changes like Woodstock attendees hailing the next performer on stage. One suspects Father Jorge Mario Bergoglio belonged to this category. But there were also plenty who, having seen nothing particularly wrong with what the church had been doing in the first half of the 20th century, or to speak more truthfully, over the better part of her history, fell into step with the new regime in a crippling exercise of blind obedience, a Soviet-style re-education. When people in this category have lived long enough to have seen the beginnings of a turnaround under John Paul II, then an increasing movement of restoration under Benedict XVI, and most recently a positive cranking up of traditionalism under Francis, they feel, or felt, if no longer with us, exceedingly bitter that they were forced to give up all the beautiful and meaningful old things, while today's young priests and laity get to have them again. For people browbeaten into the spirit of Vatican II, it can feel like a second and more subtle wave of psychological abuse. To watch traditions, devotions, and markers of Catholic identity that were once ripped from their souls now entering back into the church, as if, instead of being frowned upon, banished, or destroyed, they had only been misplaced in a closet owing to an unfortunate misunderstanding. It could also easily prompt feelings of guilt. Older folks may be reminded of how little resistance they offered to changes that may have struck them as wrong-headed at the time, or how they failed to take more steps to control the anarchy that engulfed the faithful. They may feel judged and rejected in proportion to the reappearance of more demanding forms of Catholic life and liturgy. Generally speaking, the Old Mass and much that goes with it embody and practically cry out a unified and coherent Catholicism, one that encompasses the fiery polemics of the Church Fathers, the towering dogmatic theology of the doctors of the Church, the intricate and intimate poetry of the mystics, the uncompromising fortitude of the ascetics and martyrs. It represents the Catholic faith in all its otherworldly, culturally dominating grandeur. This vision is definitely not something that the men without chests of our age, those who have been tamed into political correctness, religious privatism and pluralism, and the gospel of social justice and ecological consciousness, not to mention those with undisciplined or unnatural sexual proclivities, are capable of handling. It is too hot to handle. It is pretty much the repudiation of the modern experiment, including the runaway experiment of Vatican II. So it's understandable that those who are committed to this experiment at all costs, either from personal conviction or because it was browbeaten into them at a vulnerable age, will tend to react strongly against the very things that epitomize the Catholicism they were taught to hate, which, moreover, was supposed to have been superseded, purged, expelled. Regrettably, there is still a massive lack of support on the part of the Church's hierarchy for good initiatives, or translated into personal terms, for those good clergy and laity who are rolling back the arduous ambiguities, dated updatings, and Sesame Street banality of the post-conciliar status quo, and reaching for something that looks, sounds, smells, and feels Catholic, and actually is Catholic when you subject it to close scrutiny. There was also, for the longest time, no official acknowledgement that anything had ever gone amiss after Vatican II, or any passing nod that something might be adrift in the Reformed liturgy. Too many of our shepherds still live in total denial. We had to learn to use our own eyes and ears to figure out the truth. We had to dig for answers ourselves. And as we found the answers, we realized more and more clearly why the hierarchy had been and continues to be so eerily silent in the face of spreading apostasy. For them to admit to what really happened and to propose a substantive spiritual remedy, they would first need to confess a catastrophic lack of prudence, wisdom, and charity on the part of the church's hierarchy, past and present. And second, follow it up with a concrete plan to recover the plenitude of Catholic tradition. Pride gets in the way of such an act. And, to be sure, a misplaced fear that admitting such errors on the part of churchmen and turning the ship around in a different direction will destroy the confidence of Catholics in their shepherds. Well, guess what, Your Excellencies? It's already happened. The confidence is nearly annihilated at this point, after decades of clerical sex abuse cover-ups, if nothing else. It would have been far better for you to tell the truth and to have gained both the merit of humility and the advantage of looking honest to the faithful. Now you bishops have neither. You may have our obedience within well-understood limits, but you have to earn our trust from scratch, especially after the craven COVID cave-in. The way to start earning this trust is to show that you are resolutely, integrally Catholic, and above all, that you worship like Catholics. That means, in the era after Traditionis Custodes, you will never, ever cancel a Latin Mass or any of the traditional sacraments, regardless of the Herodian wrath radiating from the Vatican and seeking to wipe out the holy innocents of our day and age. The time will come, of this we can be certain, when those of the younger generations who still have the faith will rise to become the next pastors, professors, musicians, administrators, superiors, and eventually bishops of the church. They will not be perfect, and some will be tangled up in compromises, but the majority will have learned invaluable lessons in patience, perseverance, fidelity, sacrifice, and most of all, the beauty, consolation, and power of tradition. A counter-revolution is stirring. Hints of it can already be seen in dioceses around the world where good bishops, acting truly as guardians of tradition, have invited in traditional religious communities to work for the restoration of order and sanity. A revolution fails inasmuch as it crosses certain lines of divine and natural law, and it will fail faster the farther it has crossed them. The post-conciliar revolution crossed every line to the maximum degree compatible with the Church's indefectibility. Great will be the fall of its protagonists and votaries. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and they beat upon that house, and it fell, and great was the fall thereof. Equally great, nay greater, will be the triumph of the little ones who remain faithful to Christ, his blessed Mother, Holy Mother Church, and the sacred tradition that makes the Church Catholic. These are the wise men who never stopped building their house on the rock that is, simultaneously and inseparably, Christ, the truth, the faith, the papacy, and the liturgy. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and they beat upon that house, and it fell not, for it was founded on a rock. I would be remiss not to mention the particular occasion of this talk, which is the publication by Tan Books in Gastonia, North Carolina, of my most recent book on the sacred liturgy, The Once and Future Roman Rite, Returning to the Traditional Latin Liturgy After 70 Years of Exile. This book is the most ambitious of all that I have written so far, because it enters the most deeply into the enormous theological implications of the liturgical reforms of the 20th century. In this book, I argue that tradition in all its varieties is normative in Catholicism, and that there are discernible laws of organic development by which we can see the divine origins and the fittingness of the traditional Roman Rite as it grew to its Tridentine fullness, like an acorn into a grand oak tree. I show that the Novus Ordo of Paul VI, issued in 1969, is a different rite, bearing superficial resemblances, but different at its genetic level. That Benedict XVI's legal solution of speaking of two forms, though it was clever, was destined to fail as knowledge of and devotion to the traditional liturgy increased. And that Francis is right to say, there is only one Roman Rite, but entirely wrong as to which rite deserves to be called by that name. I demonstrate that Paul VI's arguments for creating a new rite are fallacious, implausible, insulting, and self-destructive, and that popes do not have unlimited authority over liturgical rites, even in their non-essential aspects. I explain why the interpretation of history